Suppose that you want to find ways of controlling the power of big tech. What are the options that you have in mind? First one, and what are the pros and cons of each one of these options? One will be to regulate big tech and what big tech can do. For example, one way of regulating big tech could be that if you are a platform utility, you cannot sell your own products and services on the platform. This is like the time when we had the railroads, and the antitrust action against the railroad over 100 years ago said if you control the railroads, you cannot even control the transportation of cargo, because that will be an anti-competitive practice against other companies who want to transport cargo. So there was a separation between owning the railroad and being in the business of cargo. You could do the same thing. If you're a Facebook, if you're an Amazon, if you are a Google, and you're the major platform, then you cannot peddle your own products because that's unfair. Secondly, there's a big debate on how much should we have privacy laws and how much privacy people should have and how to enforce it. But this is difficult. For example, in these coronavirus times, and in the case of pandemics, there's an argument to be made that big tech could be very helpful to essentially trace, track, and treat infectious diseases like COVID and other ones. So and that implies having less privacy rather than more privacy. Another argument against regulation has been made is the following one. If you have lots of regulation, there are costs of complying with that regulation, but that may paradoxically increase the market power of big tech firms, because only very large firms will be able to afford the compliance cost. For example, in Europe we have had GDPR that essentially controls data handling, breach notification, user consent, the EU copyright directive, the EU online terror regulation, also in UK and Australia, and so on and so on. And for example, the EU copyright directive is going to cost YouTube about $100 million just to build and maintain the filtering system to make sure that copyrighted material is not on YouTube. Now, YouTube can afford to spend $100 million, but if you have a smaller online business and is subject to the same copyright directive, then they may not be able to compete. So many people have been saying, we regulate big tech, we're going to make them more powerful because only big tech can afford the compliance costs. And that's actually one of the reasons why now Amazon and Facebook and Google and so on are saying, regulate us, please regulate us. The paradoxical implication of regulation might be more power to them because those regulated firms are too big to break Breakup, the compliance costs are high, and therefore the entrenched incumbents are going to become even more entrenched. So as an alternative to traditional regulation, people say, let's try to force more competition in the big tech firms' goods and services. For example, you could force a non-discrimination rule that avoids a preference being given to your own product, as it's being done right now. Or for example, you can make products that are offered by third parties interoperable with a plug-and-play system with the dominant company's offering. So anybody can plug their own services into, say, Facebook or into Amazon without having to go through their own services. And you could have a legal defense for these companies so they're not subject to the same kind of liability like big businesses. Or, for example, as I pointed out, the platform utilities could be forced not to offer their own goods and services like the railroads and the separation between railroad construction and owning the cargoes. For example, part of the Elizabeth Warren proposal on big tech is if you are a big platform utility with more than $25 billion of revenue, you cannot own both the platform and its users. Either you're a platform or you're a user providing your services and goods and so on, but you cannot be both. That will be, again, a form of allowing greater competition. A third option, apart from regulation and forcing more competition, will be to break up some of these big tech firms because they're too big and too powerful. Now, politically, of course, that's hard to do, and you might even have to change competition law in the United States because traditional competition policy doesn't allow you to do that. For example, you could force Facebook to divest from WhatsApp, Instagram, or Messenger. That would be one way of breaking up. Or you could force Amazon to to divest itself from all the white label product that is offering, that are basics Amazon. Or you could force Google to divest itself from Waze and Maps or services of that sort. Now, if you force a breakup of these countries, of course, you lose the potential benefits of the big network. However, of course, if you have data and app interoperability, then the network effect can be remaining even if you're breaking up this larger corporation. Now, however, if you think about it, the key problem of Facebook is not that it owns Instagram, but rather the fact that Facebook tries to keep you on his own network and then feed you targeted ads and make money this way. So think of it this way. Suppose that instead of having 5 huge big tech giants, you had 100 of them, but they all have the wrong business model. And the wrong business model is one in which you have a very rapacious excavation of everybody's data and information. You're using locational data, and you're using using everything that is available to train your AI system. Even if you had 100 companies doing that, as opposed to only 5 doing that, that business model that exploits your data in such a rapacious way, it's not the right one. So it's not the question of whether you have 5 of these guys doing it or 100 of them doing it is wrong, and therefore that's the kind of a behavior that you have to try to control. A fourth option would be the one of having the users controlling more the data they produce and they own it. For example, one variant of this proposal would be data ownership. If Facebook or Google or Amazon is using your data, they have to pay you for the use of your data. Second option will be the one of data portability. Sometimes you don't want to switch from a network to the other because you're losing all the data and information that you build over time. What if you could take the entire data on Facebook and move it on another platform? That will be the concept of data portability. The third one, as I pointed out, is the idea of data interoperability. You could have third parties offering a variety of apps and goods and services, blocking apps, switching app stores, rather than having to use the app store of Google or the one of Apple and so on. A fourth variant of the same idea will be that the big tech will have to share their data with their competitors, as the control of data gives you bigger power. This is the idea, for example, of open banking in EU that has led to a development of many fintech firms providing a variety of financial services by using the data that are the ones that the banks tend to have. And of course, you have the GDPR initiative in Europe, even if so far it seems like it's not been very effective. A fifth option to deal with the power of big tech, of course, will be to tax big tech more, because big tech is engaged in tax arbitrage across jurisdiction. This is what Europe, for example, is trying to do by introducing digital taxes on the American big tech firms, but the Trump administration is pushing back against this European attempt to introduce digital taxes. They say they bias you against American firms. They don't bias you against American firms. They're across the board. It happens that these big tech firms tend to be mostly American, and there is now a risk of a tariff war between US and Europe on this issue of whether the Europeans should be allowed to have digital taxes or not. Now, what we may also need over time is going to be a change in the US antitrust laws and the doctrines, because as I pointed out, the consumer welfare standard doesn't make sense in a world in which there are a bunch of free apps, and actually you're increasing your market power by reducing prices and engaging for a while in predatory pricing. And one of the debates, of course, within Europe on tech policy and digital policy is whether the EU should change the enforcement of competition policy to allow the growth of EU national champions, because in the tech sector you don't have EU national champions like you do in US or China, or whether you should maintain the competition policies and go after the anti-competitive practices of the US and the Chinese big tech firms. So what should be the approach of Europe? Now, there are significant differences between United States and Europe on competition policy. Traditionally, US believes more in the markets eventually self-correcting because there is always new entrants, and in avoiding also false positives. US says we break up a company and then we make a mistake, there are significant costs, that will be a false positive. Historically, however, the European Union does not believe in the self-correcting mechanism of the markets and worries much less about false positives. So the EU has been much more aggressive on competition policies. The other point I think is important to make at this point is the following one. US and China, of course, are involved in a rivalry on who is being controlling the industries of the future, and the industries of the future are all connected to big tech. Secondly, big tech over time is going to allow you to track, trace, and treat infectious and contagious diseases like COVID or the next pandemic. And three, the strategic rivals of the United States, like China and others, are using asymmetric warfare, especially cyber warfare, to weaken the US from within as a way of pushing back against that type of misinformation and trying to manipulate the US political and social system. So the point is that actually big tech from a national security point of view is becoming important. If the US were to crack down on Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and so on, when China is trying to boost the power of Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and so on, then over time making US big tech weaker as opposed to China is going to be strategically to the disadvantage of the United States. So based on national security argument, is most likely that increasingly big tech is becoming part of that national security industrial complex, and it's going to be needed for national security purposes, and therefore it's unlikely it's going to be broken up. What is more likely is that it's going to become regulated, but if it's becoming more regulated, being part of a national champion concern is also going to remain more powerful. So how you balance that one and you maintain competition and you reduce the power and the market dominance of big tech, that's a challenge, especially now that the national security considerations are becoming more important. Let me now finally consider the fifth question, that is what to do to reduce overall income and wealth inequality. Now, of course, the very